Over to you, Mike.
Okay, thank you. Good morning. So nature-based solutions for net zero. And if we move on to the next slide, just to acknowledge this is a joint endeavour. Sarah Taylor, you've already heard from, who's chairing the call this morning. I'm Mike Morecroft. You'll hear from Ian Crosher in a minute. You won't actually be hearing from Ruth or Jessica on this occasion, but they've been very much part of the team pulling this all together, and colleagues who work with in the climate change group at Natural England. And this is the third in this series of webinars on climate change, particularly presenting to the environmental sector, conservation people, both internally and externally. So the third of four, the next one's next week on nature-based solutions to help people adapt to climate change. And we are going to be making all of these available as recordings, hopefully on the Natural England YouTube channel, but we'll email people who participated about that. So yeah, this is where we're going. I'm going to give a background on ecosystems and greenhouse gases. Ian's then going to talk about nature-based solutions in practice and some of the key issues there to contribute to climate change mitigation. Then it's going to come back to me to talk about how this all relates to agriculture and the wider issue of how we use land and how that may need to change to address climate change. Then we should have a little bit of time left at the end for questions. So the first section then on ecosystems and greenhouse gases. And stepping back from our own parochial issues to look at the global picture, we can see this rather complicated figure here, which repays probably more study than I'm going to be able to take time to give it today. But the global carbon cycle is a really important thing to bear in mind. It isn't just simply a matter of us pumping out emissions into the atmosphere. It's a lot more dynamic than that. So let me just highlight some of the key fluxes, the key transfers of greenhouse gases, particularly carbon dioxide, from the land and ocean surface into the atmosphere. So you'll see in front of you 4 big arrows, and I've highlighted the numbers with red circles. So on the left-hand side, that's the flux of fossil fuels into the atmosphere, 9.5 gigatons of carbon going into the atmosphere, which is an almost impossibly large amount to visualize. Well, it's impossible to visualize, but anyway, it's a large number, 9.5 gigatons. Now, it's not the only source of greenhouse gases going into the atmosphere. Next, going along, you'll see a slightly smaller, sort of beige-coloured upward arrow of 1.5 gigatons, and that's what's coming from land use change, particularly deforestation. Remember, this is global, it's not just the UK. So that's not as big as fossil fuel by some margin, but nevertheless, it's not trivial. But I suppose the good news, if you like, is the next 2 arrows, which are pointing down, and you can see 3.2 gigatons of carbon, which is what the land surface, through its vegetation, is absorbing from the atmosphere and storing it in particularly the soil, but also in plant material, including in timber. And this flux, if you look of the amount that the land surface, the terrestrial ecosystems are taking out of the atmosphere, is roughly a third of what's going into it from human fossil fuel emissions. The ocean's also a big sink for carbon. It's also taking a lot of carbon out, and that's roughly 2.5 gigatons for carbon. And these are the latest estimates that I could find in the literature from the end of last year. And so you can see that the balance is really important, and actually what's going into the atmosphere from ecosystems or being taken out by it really has a big influence globally on how much carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases are building up in the atmosphere. And that's kind of good news and bad news. It's bad news in the sense that degraded ecosystems tend to release particularly carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, But it's good news in that healthy ecosystems can take it out. And so there's a potential for us to do something by managing the land and the seas better to slow the rate of climate change and the build-up of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. It's worth saying right now, though, that it's not a get-out-of-jail-free card. You still have to tackle the fossil fuel issues, and I will come back to that right at the end. And I wouldn't want anyone to think that anything that we can do in terms of managing ecosystems lets us off the hook of reducing fossil fuel emissions. But it is part of the picture. It's not enough by itself, but it's an important part that can make a difference. So let's move on. And now we've zoomed in on the UK, and these are the greenhouse gas emissions by different sectors in official reporting, official statistics that we report to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And you can see here that the units are megatons of carbon or CO2 equivalents. And we can see on the left-hand side, we go from transport sector through to energy supply. Once upon a time, energy supply would have been much bigger. Now transport is the largest source of emissions. And we go on through business and residential, that's your domestic heating and so on. Then you come to agriculture, and we will come back to that one, clearly. It's an important one, and it's a net source of emissions, not of the same scale as energy supply or transport, but every emission counts. Then on to waste management, industrial processes, a very broad category called public. And then finally, the most mysterious one of all, which is actually for our purposes the most interesting one, sometimes termed LULUCF, land use change and forestry. And the interesting thing there is that's below the line, and it's because it's taking carbon out of the atmosphere. It's doing that particularly because of trees growing and taking carbon out of the atmosphere. But there are other elements in there which we'll come on to learn about a bit later, particularly emissions from peatlands, and which are actually underestimated at the moment. And when the reporting changes, it won't be such a rosy picture. But nevertheless, there's still some good news in there about the potential for land use to manage right to take carbon out of the atmosphere. Moving on to the next slide. I've mentioned this before, but there are really two ways of responding to climate change: mitigation and adaptation. Last week we were talking about adaptation. Next week we'll be talking about adaptation. And that's all about coping with the effects. But in a climate change context, mitigation is all about tackling the causes of climate change, reducing emissions and sequestering carbon. So we're talking about mitigation today. Just a bit of policy background. Why everybody within the broader environmental sector is interested in this term net zero at the moment. It reflects legislation. So in the UK, we have a Climate Change Act passed in 2008, which sets targets for reducing emissions. But the target was upgraded last year. So we are now looking to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to net zero by 2050. Now, net zero, rather than just zero, what's that all about? Well, net zero means that any emissions that do remain are balanced by processes that take carbon out of the atmosphere, including by things like tree growth. There are other ways of doing it as well, which we won't talk so much about today. It's worth just briefly delving back into why the UK is committing to net zero. And the terminology here can be tracked back to the Paris Agreement on limiting greenhouse gases. I know that I've put 2014 there, it's actually 2015, slip on my part. But anyway, back in 2015, the world, most of the nations of the world, agreed to hold the increase in global average temperature to well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels and pursue efforts to limit it to 1.5 degrees. And that was then followed up by a study by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change to look at how that might possibly happen. And they concluded that greenhouse gas emissions needed to decrease by about 45% from 2010 levels by 2030 and reach, here's the phrase, net zero around 2050. We'd just note that's a global analysis, and you might well argue that countries like the UK should be ahead of the game there, given our greater resources and science base and so on. But also I wouldn't want, although I won't come back to it particularly today, it's also clearly really important to make large progress by 2030. And this is something that really is quite important for a country like the UK, to do the quick wins as soon as possible to really get on the right track. Okay, well, I'm coming towards the end of the introductory section, but this phrase, nature-based solutions, and if you inhabit the world I do, nature-based solutions has sort of taken off as the fashionable thing to be doing. And it's worth just unpacking a little bit more what's meant by nature-based solutions. So here's a definition that's probably most widely used from the IUCN, International Union for the Conservation of Nature. So actions to protect, sustainably manage and restore natural or modified ecosystems that address societal challenges effectively and adaptively, simultaneously providing human well-being and biodiversity benefits. Now that's a complete mouthful, I know that, but really the key thing is at the end that you're trying to deliver human well-being as well as, and at the same time as biodiversity benefits. You're looking for the sort of win-win. And just unpack that a little bit more. Nature-based solutions is a broad concept. It's not just about climate change, but it does include climate change mitigation and adaptation, and that's where a lot of the interest is at the moment. There are some differences of opinion about whether you can include things like production forestry or agroecosystems as true NBS. Now, we are going to talk a little bit about environmentally friendly agriculture today and not get hung up on that, but it's probably fair to say it isn't really a true nature-based solution if it's not involving natural ecosystems to some extent. Okay, and you should now have a picture of three hoops just illustrating that there is an overlap between nature-based solutions and the net zero target. There's a lot which isn't, which is one in one heading but not the other. And also, importantly, a lot of targets around recovering nature, restoring nature. There's overlap. But each of these do have different elements. So we're kind of particularly interested in the points at which you can deliver multiple benefits from the same action. And I'm going to go quite quickly through this slide. It's quite complicated. It's based on a research report that Natural England published back in 2012, looking at different carbon storage and also sequestration and emissions from different semi-natural habitats. And the key message I really want to take away from this is that actually some natural habitats are large sources of emissions, and those are particularly peatlands. And you can see represented here, perhaps you can see my cursor around degraded blanket bog and some other wetlands. But some are good sources of taking up carbon, and particularly around woodland and forest here. And we'll be unpacking this as we go along, so I won't dwell on that. And I should also say that report's being updated at the moment. But there's really four big wins. Peatland restoration, woodland creation, salt marsh restoration, and also seagrass restoration. And there are other things we can do which are also beneficial for climate change mitigation, but those are kind of the big wins as we see them at the moment. The data is very well understood for woodland creation, reasonably well understood for peatlands. The coastal habitats and the marine, the data's The data's developing quickly, but it's probably not quite as clear at the moment. Now, I'm 1 minute over my target, but I'm going to hand over to Ian at this point to look in more detail at nature-based solutions in practice. So, over to you, Ian.
Thanks a lot, Mike. Good morning, everybody. Just check you can hear me.
I can, yep.
Excellent, that's great. Okay, I'm going to talk a bit about peatlands, a bit about woodlands, and then a little bit about the marine habitats as well. So the slide that Mike showed before. So we've got a lot of peatland in this country. We're one of the big countries with a lot of peatlands. Not every country has the extent that we do, but we've historically degraded them a lot. So we've drained a lot of them, particularly for food production, crop production, particularly in the fens, Somerset levels, around north of Liverpool and Manchester area. We've also, in the uplands, used them very intensively, put lots of grips in to try and drain them, and also burnt them very intensively. And we put a lot of forestry on our peatlands, often because they were considered to be, fairly unuseful land, I think. And usually we're trying to dry them out and put, traditional agricultural practices on them. Trees obviously grow a lot better when they're dry, crops grow better when they're dry. And the thinking was that grass growth would be a lot better if we dried out the peatlands and the uplands as well. Next slide, please. I'll keep talking while that's happening. So the peatlands have been degraded in many ways, and consequently that's released a lot of emissions. So this is a diagram that tries to sort of highlight that. The more effective we've been at draining those peatlands, and the lower we've managed to get the water table, then the higher the emissions have been, basically. So this is a conceptual model that really tries to highlight the ecosystem state and how degraded or intact it is, and it gives it 6 different levels, basically. The most degraded being 1, 6 being the most intact, and as you go up, you decrease. And our peatlands have been pretty much fit into all of these categories, with the highest emissions ones on the bottom left-hand corner and the least emissions ones on the top right-hand corner. And really that's also about how well they're functioning. So there's a number of key things. One is about abiotic factors, things like drainage, temperature and things like that also affect these things, and also the biotic. So, where we've still got good semi-natural vegetation that hasn't been too damaged, will be up at the high end of 6. Where we've got degradation of that biotic component will be in 5, and then when it really degrades down to a poorer state, a different type from peatland vegetation, it degrades. So next slide, Mike. And really we're trying to look for things with lots of sphagnum on the right hand, and the ones that we've intensively drained on the left hand. So over the last 10 years, really, there's been a lot of work on what the UK peatlands are emitting and how much they're emitting. And this report, which was released last year but was written in 2017, is all about, what the UK peatlands and the different types of peatlands are emitting. So 23.1 million tonnes of CO2 equivalent per year. from our peatlands, and in England, for us particularly, that's 11.1 million tonnes. So just under half of our peatlands comes from that. So next slide. And a couple of examples there of, the type of what that actually means. So if we break this down into the different land use types and the greenhouse gas emissions from each of those land use types, so that report, the Evans et al. Work, broke peatlands down into lots of different categories and gave each one of those an emissions factor, if you like. So where they could split them out, they would try and do that. Where it wasn't possible to do that, then it wasn't. And this really is looking at English peatlands. You can see the percentage area of English peatlands there against the emissions. So pretty much starting at the highest emissions at the top, so croplands, it's only 24% of English peat, but it's releasing 64% of the emissions. So very high, 3 times the area to emissions. Then we get to intensive grassland, so 9.6%, down to 19.8%. And as you come down that, so this is to do with, area V, how high the emissions are for that land use and what's being released. And the last 2 categories down the bottom are really where we're trying to get to, or want all our peatlands to be, ideally from an emissions point of view, which is re-wetted peat, basically, and that includes fen peat as well, or ones that haven't been very badly damaged. And so, we're trying to move as many of those categories higher up down into that bottom categories, or look for other solutions. Okay, next slide. This is just briefly to sort of put those 2 figures into context. What does that really mean in terms of where we are on emissions? So, it's about equivalent to 2.8 million households for the UK and 1.37 million households for England itself. Okay, next slide. And you can see in that diagram it's coming down, so hopefully by 2030 it will have reduced again. This is just to touch on paludiculture or wet agriculture as a slightly different solution. So croplands is the big area there, 64% of the emissions coming from that. Paludiculture is a potential way of looking for a sort of interim or a slightly different solution. So traditionally we've always drained things to have our agricultural systems, but actually more and more work's being done on, well, the emissions is all about how wet that peat is. If you get the water table back up to surface, then the emissions massively reduce, but could you still produce crops on that wetted surface? And so there's quite a bit of work now being done on that, and some stuff, particularly in the Great Fen project, looking into how you can do that. But, it's early days on that. That would massively reduce the emissions and still keep some of those areas in agricultural production, although it might not be for food. A lot of the crops are more to do with other uses at the moment. Okay, next slide, please. So we've spent 15, 20 years really gaining massive amount of experience and knowledge on how to restore all our peatlands. And, we have a great deal of knowledge in this country of how to do that, particularly in the uplands, but, more and more so in the lowlands as well. And, there's a really good potential story there in terms of how we can do this and know how to do it now could roll it out into a lot further areas with good funding and putting the right species like sphagnum moss back into that system. Okay, next slide, please, Mark. Okay, I'm going to go on to talk a bit about woodland. Probably the more understood carbon sequestration form, and this is some of the sort of information about it and how it is important. So obviously in the general election in the autumn, all the political parties were bidding strongly to plant the most amount of trees, which is very encouraging, really. It's certainly a big part of the solution, and one that hopefully we will deliver. So at the moment, our woodland cover in England is 10%, compared with the UK is 13%, so quite small. 12% of that woodland is ancient semi-natural woodland, the highest biodiversity value woodland, which is about 1.2% of England is ancient woodland. So a fairly small part, considering that a lot of England would have been wooded historically at one time. We're now fairly degraded woodland cover, so a lot of potential to put a lot more woodland back. And the current woodland targets take us from 13 to 18% of UK land surface. That would deliver annual carbon sequestration of around 15 million tonnes of CO2, approximately, basically. I think the figures are between 13 and 18, depending on what type of species and trees you plant. Okay, next slide. So just to sort of highlight that point, I came across this bit of work from Yale School of Forestry, but in terms of, how many trees does each person in the UK have? Well, we're right down the bottom of 47 when you compare that to Canada at the top with 10,000 plus trees per person. And Greenland, surprisingly, not somewhere you would have thought particularly to be treed, but and even Australia, prior to all the fires, has a lot of trees per person. So, we've got a lot of potential to put a lot more trees back, and the positives from that. Next slide. So how does that make up in terms of our woodland? How much of it is broadleaf or conifer? Well, in England, 75% is broadleaf woodland, and that's our most important carbon store. So in this, we've really got to be really clear that we've got to retain as much of that woodland as possible in its present form and expand it out. There's no point losing stuff and then having to put younger stuff back in, which won't be as high a carbon store. Next slide. So this is around carbon stocks and standing trees. So across England, particularly, you can see what's in conifers and what's in other parts, and how that differs between different parts of the woodland. So the standing timber, if you like, the stems, compared with the other parts of that system. And you can see that half of the thing is in England compared with Scotland, even though there's a lot more. I was going to say area of trees, but I'm wrong in it. Okay, next slide. this is really looks at the emissions. So, carbon is one thing. This is a slightly different way of looking at it. What each of those actually, as it photosynthesizes, locking in each year, and then some of those losses as well. So, 26 million tonnes of CO2 back into the UK thing, but then we lose some as well. So wood products obviously go out of the system, and how that equates really. So greenhouse mass from forest management, other things and loss within that, and obviously it also has things like the timber haulage and stuff like that. But obviously really important, carbon store and carbon sequestration. Okay, next slide. Really just to make the point here that, protecting our high carbon ecosystems and making them resilient for the future is probably our most important thing that we need to do as number one, then put new woodlands in and around those to help that. So ancient woodlands, highest carbon stores of any of our woodland types, and previously ancient woodland sites, pores, also still have very high carbon stores in the soil layer as well, because they've been continuously woodland cover all that time. Restoring our ancient woodland network and expanding the woodlands surrounding this area is really, really important, and hopefully will be a big part of the nature recovery network with that. There is a data layer that's come out just at Easter with the Habitat Networks maps that have been developed by Jeff Edwards, Michael Knight, Sarah Taylor, and myself. And there's an ancient woodland layer on that is a really good place to start thinking about that. Okay, next slide. Yeah, really just to reiterate that, carbon sequestration varies, and it varies quite a lot with different species of trees, different soil types, different climate. Warm, dry climates can grow better trees and very wet and cold ones, up to a point, obviously, drought and things like that. And also spacing makes quite a difference, trees packed together, or do you have them further apart? At different parts in that growth cycle of the trees, you can see that. This diagram is purely just to represent that, but you can see on here that actually some of the broadleaf species grow pretty well up until 20 years. And, our 2050 target is, in 30 years' time. And actually there's quite a variation in what we choose and where we put them to how much we can lock back into the system in terms of carbon. Right, next slide. Okay, so this is a quote from Oliver Rackham that I think sums it up really well. So growing trees on mineral soils is really important. Organic soils usually involve disturbance to grow those trees, and that means you get more release of carbon from the soil. And trees on mineral soils grow better. It's approximately about 30% better carbon uptake on mineral soils than carbon soils, but obviously different soil types vary and different species vary within that. It's quite a broad assumption. And just trying to make it really clear how and where we want to do this, and how we get that major benefits for both nature and carbon sequestration, together is really important. We can put these in the right place or the wrong place. Obviously, avoiding planting on peat soils, which we've already sort of talked about. by planting on peat soils, we're probably going to exacerbate the peatland emissions. So we don't want to do that, and we want to put these in a place that they're delivering the most amount of benefit to us. Next slide. I just very quickly highlight there's two pretty good tools that are out there already. One is the Woodland Carbon Code, where you can work out, depending on what you're planting, the carbon that you're going to get from that activity, and the Peatland Code as well. So both really good mechanisms for incentivising and helping deliver that activity. Next slide. Just to say, grasslands and heathlands are still really important, and we shouldn't be putting woodland at the detriment of these things. They're absolutely important carbon stores in their own right, as all our semi-natural habitats are. So pretty much if you've got a semi-natural habitat, it's going to be a better carbon store probably than one that's in agricultural use, because the carbon, if you like, the growth of the plants and things isn't being taken off at the same level. Grassland is still very important. It is a very important grassland soil, mainly because it covers so much of the country. So, 36% of England is grassland, and so it is storing carbon in the soil, and it's nearly all in the soil. So, and our semi-natural habitat. So we shouldn't be, affecting one to affect the other. We need to deliver both in unison, really. Next slide. Okay, just a summary slide. This is the land use and forestry emissions, just in a form, so you can see the areas that are growing trees, the green parts, and the emissions from peat. This is actually going to change, so that this doesn't include all the peatland stuff, and the inventory, when that peatland inventory part comes into it in the next couple of years, will change the shape of how this looks somewhat. So, but it gives you a good impression of, where we've got lots of trees in an area and where we've got lots of cropland, if you like, that's on high organic soils releasing. So, next slide. We're just going to move on to coastal and marine habitats. So this is just to really highlight how important these are. They are less understood, but the knowledge is, developing fast on this. This diagram really highlights three of those. So salt marsh habitats, really important. 37,000 tonnes a year here, but we are losing salt marsh generally on an annual basis. So, that's going down, and obviously with sea level rise and things like that, it's an area that's potentially under threat. Seagrass, again, really important, but actually we've lost a lot of our seagrass, and it has a lot of potential to be restored and really expand that out. And one that's really sort of being more understood now is the shelf sea sediments, and how they're locking in quite a lot. And obviously, marine protected areas and things like that will really help to protect quite a lot of those habitats. So there's a big win there. Next slide. So, salt marsh, this is some of the figures around it. So 15% loss of salt marsh since 1945, losses to agriculture industry, but there is quite a lot of potential to put that back, and that if we increase our salt marsh will help with both climate adaptation and mitigation. Next slide. So seagrass restoration, there's quite a big project that's set going in the last year, really, to try and expand and do this. Again, really important habitat for that. So, yeah, the figures there, 0.2% global cover, stores 10% of global carbon. So a lot more important in lots of other parts of the world. But that's mainly because the UK has lost so much of its seagrass meadows. And, we've still losing it today. And the more we can get that restoration and turn that around, the more great sequestration that will happen. Okay, next slide. I think that's the last one. I'm going to hand back over to Mike then.
Great. Okay, thank you. Well, we're coming into the last 10 minutes. I'm going to talk a little bit more about agriculture and how that relates to the bigger picture of land use change. I've been trying to follow the chat as we've been going along whilst not dropping the ball and moving slides for Ian. And lots of really good stuff coming up there, particularly about trees, and we'll try and answer that at the end. If we can't, we'll we won't manage to do all of it, but we are producing a sort of FAQ, question and answer document, which we will circulate when we've had a chance to respond a bit more fully. But good questions. Right. So agriculture and land use. Interactions between the LULUCF sector, if you remember that, and the agricultural sector. And really all of the sort of things that, as I guess most of us are environmental people working in the environmental sector, we have to take note of the fact that actually 70% of the land area in England is used for agriculture. And we still need to eat, and food security continues to be a priority, of course. So the different, in terms of what we can do in terms of restoring ecosystems, that's framed to a large extent by how agriculture proceeds and the importance of trying to deliver mitigation of climate change within agriculture at the same time as also producing food and not displacing it somewhere else, the production of it. And you'll find that term displacement comes up a couple of times. That means really saying that because we've done something more environmentally friendly in this country, we're actually importing more food from somewhere else, which may or may not be grown in a sustainable way. That's clearly not a good situation to have. So this little graphic just indicates the wide range of different factors that are affecting land use change in agriculture. Looking at agricultural emissions and bearing in mind that some of the sort of wider land use emissions are reported under this other category, you can see that going back to 1990, there's been an overall decline in agricultural emissions by around 16%. But something really important to bear in mind is a lot of this is coming from methane and nitrous oxide, not from carbon dioxide. Methane, partly from things like slurry spreading, but also, very importantly, from livestock. And nitrous oxide often as a result of fertilizer applications. Now, there's been a lot of publicity recently about the different global warming potentials of methane and carbon dioxide. And I just wanted to spend a moment to explain this, although we're not going to have time to go into the full details. But methane is about 28 times more potent as a greenhouse gas than CO2 in terms of how much heat it traps within the system. The big difference, though, is that methane does break down in the atmosphere, whereas CO2 doesn't. CO2 can be absorbed by plants, as we've seen, but it doesn't break down. So CO2 goes on accumulating in a way that methane doesn't. The half-life of methane, the time for the concentration to half, is about 10 years. And there are ways, the so-called GWP star figure that's been used as a alternative way of measuring that. But it is fair to say that methane emission reductions will make a significant difference and rapidly on climate change. For the longer term, the CO2 matters more, and overall it is a bigger factor. But there is an important role to play for reducing ammonia emissions. And let's just go on to look a little bit more at what farm-based emissions reductions might look like. And a few of these might arguably be considered, well, I was going to say considered nature-based solutions. I don't think truly any of them really are, but that's not to say they're not important. And I just want to say a little bit about livestock. I mean, some of this about how, nitrogen use efficiency, it's probably for another day. But in terms of livestock, there is no doubt that cows produce methane, and if we had less cows, we would less dairy products, we would have less methane. But different systems do vary. More expensive systems would produce less. So, and of course, many conservation systems rely on grazing by livestock, including cattle. So I'm not going to pretend it's a simple answer, but it's an important issue. Something where we've got a particular interest in is around agri-environment schemes, particularly at the moment countryside stewardship, although that will be replaced by the environmental land management system over the next few years. And a study, which this is a kind of sneak preview of what's coming. So we do have a study that's been carried out for us by Doug Warner and colleagues at the University of Hertfordshire, funded by DEFRA, looking at how much benefit is coming from countryside stewardship scheme for emissions reductions. And the estimate is it's about 1.2 megatons of CO2 equivalents per year. So it's not a total game changer, but it's a really good contribution. I think it's worth just sort of saying though there are some trade-offs here with production. So creating and restoring semi-natural habitats, which I suppose is where my heart is as a conservationist, and it's supported by environmental stewardship. And countryside stewardship does have a big impact per unit area, but there is a risk of loss of production and higher displacement. So getting the right incentive to do the right thing in the right place and, to actually productively manage land where it can produce high yield with low emissions is a really important part of freeing up the less productive land for restoration. But also increasing carbon within the farmed landscape. Things like hedgerows and buffer strips, and then finally at the bottom, what we can do to maintain production but reduce emissions per unit of yield. And there are some potential options there around cover crops, management of maize, low input grassland, where actually potentially you could do that, and that obviously carries much less risk around displacement of production elsewhere. Let's move on. It's been touched on, but I have to flag up one of the things that I continue to worry about is what do we do with lowland agricultural peat, particularly in East Anglia, the Fens, highly productive agricultural systems creating a huge amount of greenhouse gas emissions. And this just really shows two options here from a field visit some of us in Natural England did about 18 months ago. One is the Great Fen project on the left. We're actually looking at full restoration to semi-natural habitat. The other on the right is G's growers, actually working out in the Fens to try and go on producing crops, but do it without the same level of emissions. So maintaining raised water levels, maintaining organic inputs to the surface. And the balance between those, I think, to be honest, the jury is out, and paludiculture, wet agriculture comes in there again. I think though we can't kid ourselves. There are easy solutions here, but there are a range of options which need a lot more work on. So wrapping all this up, if we put it all together, what does it look like? Well, I do commend to you the analysis done by the Committee on Climate Change, published in January this year. what they looked at, and their conclusions was that as part of achieving net zero, we could be looking at 22% of what's currently agricultural land converted to forests or peatland restoration or used for biofuels. Now, we haven't talked about biofuels, but they are a part of the mix. And they assumed an increase in forest cover from 13 to 17% and 30,000 hectares a year of forest creation at a UK scale. Looking a little more detail, what that might look like as well, some of the other things that come in there. You can see there's different elements there, but also I will just flag up that dietary change and reducing food waste are an important component of actually making the sums add up and doing all we want to do on limited land area. Also, the way we use forest products, you see there's forestry land and forest other. That's all about what you do. For example, if you use timber in building that stands for, many decades, it's going to have more benefits for carbon than if it goes for wood pulp. Yeah, we've already really covered this, I think. Nature-based solutions are place-specific, and doing the right thing really matters, and it's true in this country. It's true also in the savannas, where there's been a real controversy about woodland encroachment. And I want to flag up again, and I really am nearly there now, the forthcoming publication on carbon storage and sequestration by habitats, where we're going to be looking into this in a lot more detail, and also that report on the benefits of countryside stewardship for climate change mitigation from the University of Hertfordshire. Our carbon storage report will come out probably late summer, early autumn. University of Hertfordshire much sooner, hopefully. So some final conclusions then, and then I'm going to hand back to Sarah, and I think Ruth's going to say something as well about responding to some of the questions. But just in brief, ecosystems are a critical part of the global carbon cycle. They can be sources or sinks. Nature-based solutions are essential for delivering net zero and much else beside, but where they're delivered is critical, and also they're not sufficient by themselves, and phasing out of fossil fuels remains essential. I'm handing back to you, Sarah, with about 7 minutes to go.
Yeah, brilliant, thank you. And I'm afraid 7 minutes is not going to be enough time to deal with all the amazing questions and thoughts and responses we've had on the chat. So thanks very much, Mike. That was really interesting. And Ian, great stuff. And thank you, everybody, for all the questions. I've tried to gather together some thoughts on what the questions are, kind of some of the themes that are coming up. I'll start by just pointing out a few things about woodland. So people are talking about the value of woodland creation over just tree planting for carbon storage and sequestration, the differences between planting trees, planting woodland, and allowing natural regeneration or natural woodland colonization. And also bringing up the point that woodland is much more than just trees. It's a much greater ecosystem with soils and various other things as well. And then thinking about the other ways on top of planting and regeneration that we can achieve carbon sequestration, getting woodlands into better condition, making them larger, smaller. I wonder if Mike or Ruth, you want to come in on any of those things?
Well, I just very quickly say, I mean, I think I take your point entirely about most of those points, and protecting existing woodland, naturally growing out from existing woodland fragments to make a much larger woodland network. The role of semi-natural forests is really important, and I think it's worth bearing in mind that England is a little bit different to Scotland here, and I know Scottish natural heritage colleagues have been involved in some of these discussions, and we have a lot more broadleaf woodland in in England than we do in Britain as a whole, particularly in Scotland. There's a very large non-native conifer sector. I don't want to vilify production foresters, because I think actually growing timber that we can use to build buildings with, for example, rather than cement, which is also pretty bad for the environment, has to be a good thing. But we certainly want to make the case for plenty of native woodland that supports nature as well as timber. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Ruth.
Or Ian? Okay, well, we've got lots of questions to come to. One in particular, I think there was a comment made when Ian put up the slide about the peatland and woodland carbon codes. The things that aren't included in that, I think it was about the woodland one, natural regeneration isn't included in that, and in the peatland one, lowland peatlands aren't included. Ian, did you want to say anything more about the pros and cons or the benefits and not so much of the carbon codes as they stand?
Yeah, just hopefully they will develop and include some of those things as the information and science becomes better on that, really. So, I think they started at the point where they felt confident with the information they had. And the more of those schemes that get in place, the more hopefully, natural regeneration. There's a lot less evidence on it, and it's a lot more variable, so that's why it hasn't been included. But it would be good if it was in there.
Okay, thank you very much, Ian. Yeah, good. So room for changes and development of that. I don't know, do you want to say a bit more, Mike, perhaps about agri-environment schemes and mitigation? Someone was talking about the fact that when we talk about agri-environment schemes and their ability to deliver mitigation and net zero, they previously haven't necessarily been designed to do that, but going forward, the plans are hopefully looking a bit better on that. While you're speaking, Ruth, it's *6. I think you *6 and muted yourself, and try again, because I know you were trying to come in there.
Yeah, that one is particularly one which I would like Ruth to address, as she spent the last year working on guidance around elms. I could answer it, but she'll do a much better job than me. If you're there, Ruth.
Hi, Sarah. Can you hear me, Mike?
Hey.
Yeah, we can.
Hey, that's brilliant technology, eh? So we've been working with Hertfordshire to look at this. Previously, climate change mitigation has been what we call an overarching priority for our Agri-Environment scheme, so it hasn't been targeted on the ground. I think the work with Hertfordshire, what that's shown is that there's huge opportunity to do more. So we're delivering around 1.1 megatons of carbon equivalent reductions each year currently. But if we look at how options are falling out of old schemes and how we're going forward into new, I think there's lots of opportunity to do some targeting there. And there's huge scope as well to look at how we increase efficiencies within productive systems, but also benefit carbon in the farm landscape as well. So hopefully lots of scope that's relevant to lots of different farm practices as well.
Brilliant, thank you, Ruth. Just lastly, one final thing, is there's quite a lot of talk about peat in compost. It does seem like something that we've been thinking about or talking about for a long time that we haven't quite managed to get to. Why are we not banning peat in our garden, just sort of stuff that we can buy at the garden centre? Does anyone have any intelligence on that and when we're going to reach that?
Ian here. There's been a number of targets and things that were supposed to be met and haven't been really. They keep re-putting those targets in. I think the 25-year plan has some stuff in it about it. I know the peatland strategy will definitely have stuff about it. They are aware, but it's not great, really, that we've done that. We managed to solve a lot of the issue here, but then export it to other parts of the world. Ireland and Estonia and other parts of the UK. Yeah, I mean, even just getting people to buy it, to buy peat-free. But a lot of the people that have produced it have felt the pressure came off, I guess, in the early part of the last 10 years, and have sort of gone back to using peat.
Right.
So it would be great if we could. There's some great alternatives out there. So it's just getting hold of it, like people have said.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mike. Thank you very much, Ian, and everybody else who's come in with answers to questions on the chat, and Ruth for answering the question about agri-environment. We'll capture all of the questions, all of the things that you've put down in the chat, and we will capture those in a frequently asked questions type document. We'll also, if there's any references or links that were talked about or asked for, we'll put that into that document as well and circulate it. We'll be circulating the recording as well to everyone on this call and people that have missed it. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us, and have a great week. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot.